Millie moved through the woods, the hot summer sun beating down on her brow. Sweat was dripping off her face as she looked at another empty trap. The master wasn't going to be happy about this. It had been 2 days since they caught anything, and Millie could only say it was the heat for so long before the master might start getting suspicious. She would admit she had been letting some of the critters go. Quite honestly, the master had so much salted meat stored up that he really had no reason to try to be catching fresh one all the time. She went to the final trap. It sat in a clearing, what the master had proudly proclaimed he thought was a choke point, even though that didn't make a damn lick of sense. Any critter with half a mind would be able to see the shiny metal glittering under the hot summer sun. But to her surprise, there was something in the trap. Millie went over and saw a black doe, as dark as night, with eyes as white as the moon. It wasn't hurt, wasn't even here or hawing. It looked more embarrassed at the situation it had found itself in. Millie was, quite frankly, shocked. The bear trap's teeth was digging into the poor thing's hind leg, and yet it remained silent, staring at her. Millie couldn't bring herself to let such a beautiful creature be killed. She kneeled down, undid the trap. The doe seemed perplexed by what she had done. It stood up, as if its leg wasn't even hurt. It moved a bit closer. It pressed its forehead against Millie's, and without thinking, Millie cupped its little triangular face and gave it a little nuzzle. The doe licked her nose, and then began to walk back into the forest. However, it did turn back to look at her, before trotting away. Millie decided that it was high time to get back to the house, so she got up, wiped off her dress, and went. The master was on the front porch, smoking one of his cigars. He looked her up and down, and saw she was empty-handed, and grumbled out, "Where's my meat, Millie?" Millie frowned. "There ain't nothing in them traps, master. I'm really starting to think that these poor little critters out here don't want to be out in the heat no more than we do." The master went quiet. He growled to himself, told to get back in the kitchen. Millie nodded, deciding that she should at least start preparing for supper. She got some meat out, began to cut it into fine chunks, hoping to make a decent little stew, when she heard the sound of hooves right outside the kitchen door. She was perplexed by it. She went to it, opened it, and there was the doe, looking up at her with its moonlight eyes. Millie didn't really know what to do. None of the critters she had ever let go had followed her back before. She decided to grab some fresh strawberries off the counter. Hopefully the master wouldn't know they were missing, and she fed them to the little deer. The doe took them, licking Millie's palm gratefully, and nuzzled into it. Millie found it to be very beautiful and incredibly endearing. She sat on the step, and the doe kneeled down, putting its little head in her lap. She gave it a few good pats. The stew was brewing, and, well, she had a little time to kill. She talked to it for a little bit, and it seemed to listen to her. She mostly went on about how hard the work was, about how angry the master was, and about how god-awful everything was, and how she wishes she was free. And the doe seemed to listen and understand her. Well, when she heard the stew boil over on the stove, she shot up, went to fix it, and the doe was gone. That night, Millie went back to her little cabin. Cabin wasn't really a right word for what the master had constructed for his help to sleep in. No, it was more comparable to little sheds. Couldn't even fit a bed in there. Millie thought it was such a cosmic joke to be given to such a cruel man. She laid on the little hay that she had found. It was some extra that no one had noticed going missing, so at least she wasn't on the hard and cold and unforgiving ground. Then she heard the distant sound of hooves. She went to the door of her shed and opened it, and there was the doe. Now, Millie was once again surprised, but very happy to see it. It made a motion like it was asking to be invited in. Millie saw no reason why she shouldn't, so she stepped aside and the deer entered. It looked around, didn't knock anything over, didn't hear or haw. It saw the bedding, and that seemed to startle it. Not physically, but its eyes widened in shock. Millie closed the door, sat in her hay, patting it, offering the doe a little space. The doe laid down next to her, and she rested on its torso. Its fur was soft, and it smelt like the spring, a clear creek, fresh flowers, honey and pollen. She inhaled deeply and relaxed against it, and fell asleep. Time passed, as time often does, and, well, summer turned to fall, and fall turned to winter. When the winter time came, the master was in full hunting mode, and he always hosted an annual party. A bunch of rich old white men coming, sitting, boasting about their kills, and Millie honestly had no taste for it. However, she had had her deer, and the other slaves on the plantation knew of the deer as well, but Millie had always been the deer's favorite, and Millie was grateful every time she got to see the little doe. It was on the night of the party that the doe came again. Millie gave it some fruits that, thankfully, had not spoiled in the cold. However, what she had not noticed was her master standing in the threshold of the kitchen doorway. He stomped in like a bat out of hell, grabbing Millie by the back of the head, pulling her curly hair and throwing her to the ground. He stripped off his belt and started to whip her with it. Millie curled in on herself, covering her face, hoping to at least save it from the harsh strikes, until she heard a blood-curdling scream. She looked up and saw the doe had sunk its teeth into the master's leg. The man dropped to the ground in fright, and the doe shook him like a dog. And, well, Millie did what she thought she could only do. She screamed. She screamed for it to go, to run, to get, before one of those damn hunting men came in and shot the poor thing. The doe let go of the master's leg and looked at her, its maw bloody, and it listened, leaving the kitchen and going into the woods. The master got up, grabbed Millie, and threw her in her shed, locking it from the outside. Told her that if she wanted to be in cahoots with the critters, she can live like a critter and she can starve, and went back to his party, grabbing Miss Mariah to finish the meal. Millie cried. She cried for a long time. She could hear the faint sound of hooves outside her door, but there wasn't much she could do to open it. But the sound was comforting, and through the cracks of the walls she smelt the spring, and she was able to fall asleep. The moon was full, and all of the guests had left. The master sat in his parlor with his 3 most trusted hounds, sipping some whiskey and looking into the fire. It had been a rough night. His leg was bandaged up from that damn doe's attack. He'd never seen an animal act so violent before, especially towards a man. Well, he was finishing his book up when he heard hooves. He got up, waddled over to the window, and saw there at the edge of the property the doe, dry blood still on its maw, and its eyes shining like the moon. The master growled, opened his front door, and whistled for his hounds, told them to get, and all 3 of them raced after the doe, chasing it into the dark. The master smiled, knowing his hounds would come back with a lovely little prize for him that he'd hang on his wall. He'd probably show it to Millie, too. Maybe that would teach the damn girl to not go against him. An hour passed. The master began to get worried, until he heard his dogs barking and yelping. He opened the door, but there was only two. The master was a little shaken by that. He supposed his third one was just being a little persistent, still trying to get that doe. He let the two in, and they sat by the fire. Some more time passed, and he heard the hooves again. He waddled up to the window and saw the doe was now on his property. And that just would not do. He whistled for his dogs once more, opened the front door, and watched them for as long as he could, hearing them bark and snap at the deer. And just like before, time passed, but only one of his dogs came back. Poor thing looked shaken, looked frightened, and that in turn frightened the master. He sat down with him, gave the dogs some pats and reassurance, but then the hooves again. The master got up, saw the doe was near the tree right outside his house. He whistled for his dog, and the hound didn't want to go, but he gave it a swift kick, and the dog went into flight or fight, and he geared up for a fight and chased after the doe. The master closed his door, locked it. He snuffed out the fireplace, and he waited in the dark. The ticking of the clock made his heartbeat jump, and each minute that passed made his skin crawl. And then there it was again, the sound of hooves. He crawled to the window on all fours. He peeked over the ledge and saw the doe was on the porch, staring at the front door. Its maw was bloody, but this time it was fresh. Master was horrified, and then, as he looked at it, its head slowly turned to stare at him right in the eyes. The master shot up. Even with his bad leg, he ran as fast as he could up to his room, locked himself in, got under the covers as if he was a scared little boy having a night terror. He heard the doe going through his home, the clack of its hooves against his floors. It was right outside his door, and he knew it. He hid under the covers tighter. He pulled the pillows over his face. And then everything was very quiet, very still. He dared to peek, and he saw at the foot of his bed a monster. The doe was no longer a doe. The doe was no longer of this world, and it was looming over him. Its mouth bloody, its teeth sharp, and its eyes shining like the moon. The next morning, the slaves woke up to no orders, woke up to no yelling, woke up to no demands. They all were very perplexed by this. The master was an early riser, and he wasn't afraid to beat whoever wasn't out of bed. Miss Maria went to the house, was the only one brave enough, had been there the longest, had known the master since he was a boy. She went to his room and found he was gone. However, blood was staining the walls and the sheets. She raced out of the house, telling the others. Some of them hooted and hollered in joy, grabbed their things, and made a beeline for the north. Others were scared and frightened, wondering if whatever killed the master was coming back for them too. And then all remembered Millie, how she wasn't there, and about what had happened the night before. They went to her shed, seeing the lock was still on. Abraham, the strongest of the bunch, grabbed a big old rock and smashed the lock off. They opened the door and found the little shed empty, just Millie's dress in the center of the floor. They say, on hot summer nights, when the wind is quiet and the full moon is out, you can hear dogs barking and growling. You can hear the cries of a man begging for mercy. And sometimes, if you're lucky, if you're lost and you're wandering, you'll see two does through the trees. One black as night, with its eyes as white as the moon, and the other the color of dark chocolate. And they walk side by side, and they both carry with them the smell of spring.